So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for staying for the last but not least session of the day. And our first speaker is another keynote. We're very grateful for him to be here online. And I'm going to let Claude, who knows him better, give a few words about him.
Okay, so I have the privilege and honor to introduce Milad Doueihi. So Milad, thank you so much to be with us today. And so Milad is one of the person that I know who has a cultural knowledge so large, so deep that I'm always very impressed. And so Milad has knowledge, is historian, is a philosopher, is someone who understands religions and religions topics very well in many different settings. And he has also a very deep understanding of our digital society and the way indeed digital science, technology, tools and usages are indeed converting us. And I recommend warmly to read all his books and that are very open-minded and help us to understand in which world we are currently living. So, Milad, I will not share your session. Emma will do it, but I was wanting to welcome you in this forum, and so the floor is yours for 45 minutes, including questions if you want.
Thank you very much, Claude, Emma, and thank you for inviting me and for the very kind and generous introduction, and for giving me this opportunity to share with you some reflections on some of the issues and concerns that you've been debating. I'm sorry I was not able to assist to all the sessions. I joined in a little earlier and I heard some discussions about the metaverse and so on. And perhaps it's a good way for me to enter into what I would like to discuss with you, is to sort of say a couple of things about the metaverse, not simply to enter any debates, but instead to remind you of a couple of, I guess, of historical moments that may be relevant later for the discussions we may have. First, since my talk will be sort of a minority report, it's mostly dedicated to a couple of words, if you would like, and the reason for which we have either accepted them or not, and how they have changed over time in their reception, what they mean and why they apply. And perhaps the two words we can start with is avatar and metaverse. You probably know that avatar comes from the Sanskrit. It normally designates an incarnation of the Shiva, a god figure. But what's important for us is that entered into our vocabulary, especially digital vocabulary, via very famous, if you are into that limited world of science fiction, novel by Roger Zelazny in 1966 entitled Lord of Light, where it tells the story of avatars. And since then, it has sort of invaded the discourse and inhabited the space that has become sort of second usage. Metaverse, on the other hand, is more interesting, perhaps. It's early 1990s from a novel that is sort of absolutely crucial for geeks, digital culture, and especially hackers, entitled Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. And that novel introduced the word metaverse and questioned the validity or the pertinence, I would say, ultimately, of virtual reality. And that's why the proposition was to use metaverse. Now, obviously, it was adopted and later appropriated by everyone, and you are familiar with that. Just a quick pointer is that A Snow Crash is an important novel because it set a paradigm for thinking through the relationship between digital technology, religious history, and computation linguistics. If you are familiar with the novel, it's less scene shows you an Emile Post computational machine running recursivity functions, and that's the conclusion of the novel. But more important, perhaps, or perhaps relevant for our debates and exchanges today, is that it is part of a trilogy written by Neil Stephenson. It starts with Snow Crash. In the middle, there is Cryptonomicon, which is a narrative about John von Neumann and Alan Turing, among other things, and ends about 3 years ago with a beautiful book. And if you are American, you know immediately what it means, Fall or Dodge in Hell. And it simply brings back the framing of religious narrative that is related to creativity models that are associated currently with digital technology and especially certain forms of platforming, as we call them. Anyway, this is just perhaps an interesting introduction to what I wanted to sort of share with you. My particular interest today to sort of discuss with you is that, and that's why I entitled my intervention, and thanks for Claude for allowing me to do so, Minority Report, despite the fact I'm not a big fan of Philip K. Dick, is that I was sort of looking back at the historical moments that have sort of shaped our current landscape within what we are all accepting to designate as artificial intelligence. I was struck by the fact that we have accepted the word artificial intelligence or the expression as a matter of fact, as it is refers or designates something that we can either identify or we can qualify with various reservations, perhaps. Let's go back to the beginning of the late 40s, probably late 30s, actually. But anyway, from the late 30s to very early 50s, where that whole constellation of text, of proposals, of projects came together in order to shape what we consider today artificial intelligence. Perhaps the best place to start, and I think it's very important, unfortunately very few people read it except for its technical dimension, is Alan Turing's thesis written in 1938 at Princeton with Alonzo Church on ordinals. I'm not going to bore you with the formal aspect and the mathematical or logical proofs that are deployed by Turing, but instead just point out to you that even in some of the most technical mathematical computational science, if you would like, thesis, the conclusion, which is a very significant conclusion and still today merits revisiting and evaluation, is actually devoted to an absolutely non-technical issue. It is devoted to trying to figure out or to decide or to see whether within the development of formal and formalizable logical categorical structures that have computational applications, should we rely on ingenuity or intuition? And you suddenly find yourself into a humanistic epistemological issue that is not to be determined exclusively by technical concerns. And Turing conclusion, and I'll let you read it, is available online. You can download the PDF. He says, I had hoped, or we had hoped, he uses the we, that it will be ingenuity, but we ended up relying on intuition. And he will develop further what he means by intuition and so on and so forth. This is sort of an initial framework of something that will become crucial for what now we will be calling artificial intelligence. If you go from the 1938 to the famous paper 1948, 1950, depending which version you will be reading, published by Turing, Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. Now, obviously, that's what launched the whole movement that we know today. But curiously, and if you're a careful reader, I'm a philologist by training, so you end up reading, much more carefully about certain aspects, you will notice three things. First of all, the word intelligence only appears in the title, and it's nowhere to be found within the body of the text, which is about 40 pages long. Second, he's interested in one thing, he called it thinking machines, not intelligent machines. And I think the distinguish between thinking and intelligence is very crucial, and we will have to keep coming back to it, because today we can frame it within the divide that exists while evaluating large language models, whether they have reasoning powers or whether they simply repeat by identifying, in no matter how complex ways, certain patterns that can be identified by statistical or stochastic methods. So we already have a curious divide by Turing between intelligence and thinking. And then he goes on to describe the imitation game, respond to objections that are possible to his method. But what I would like to simply point out is just simply the end, the last 3 pages, which are absolutely quite impressive because today they are totally with us. He basically decides to compare his thinking machine to a child. And suddenly we move from thinking to learning. The machine is compared, and I think the comparative method is absolutely crucial, to a child who's inserted within a certain social environment, and the child will learn by various methods. And I think today we find precisely this argument extensively present in either defending or criticizing or providing various models in order to both evaluate and to improve the proficiency, the accuracy, the validity, legitimacy of large language models. But there's one issue that comes up. If you read Turing very carefully, you very quickly realize that this childhood is without end. The machine is going to continue to remain a child as it learns. And I think that is a very serious question for us, because that's one of the arguments that we tend to get, that do not worry right now, we will try to improve, we'll correct errors, we'll fix so-called hallucinations, and yet we remain with this sort of endless childhood. Now, if you're a reader of science fiction, you know that childhood, um, with or without end, have a particular dystopian connection, and you can check out the novel that is associated with that. And yet, Ogol, I remind you that comparing the machine to a childhood and to learning has a very long historical history that comes repeatedly at any moment we have a shifting in scientific paradigms. It starts with Chancellor Bacon, we'll find it in Newton, and we'll find it in the 19th century, and now we find it in the mid 20th century, when we change our models for science and what science is supposed to be or how is it supposed to function, and especially, I would say, what is the particular status of scientific knowledge and the relationship between inherited or transmitted knowledge from the past and the current emergence of new forms, if you would like, of knowledge that are embodied by something like today we will call the machine. So this is the first moment where we find this peculiar sort of word childhood becomes very important. One last comment on childhood before I move on. There's been a number of scientific works. You can look at archive.org and so on and so forth. They're arguing in order to improve generative AI, we should refer to tiny stories instead of large models. We should go for the smaller, more granular instead for the broad and large scale. And the model that is always used to justify and explain the scientific options and choices is childhood. So suddenly what I would like to simply point out to you is that the institution of childhood is slightly being modified in the way we receive it through the lens and the filter of how digital algorithmic culture is reshaping our understanding. What does it mean for a child to learn, to associate, to interact? So I think this is sort of one very interesting thing that has nothing to do with intelligence, because we all know, despite obviously some children have all kind of forms, what we call intelligence, but it is this sort of complex ecosystem in which it is working that is obviously very significant and very important. So this is sort of one first aspect. Second aspect, when we go back to intelligence itself. Now, obviously, I sort of talked about Turing, but let's look at what really launched, at least only in the US and later everywhere else, the so-called artificial intelligence movement. It's a summer proposal for school at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, by 2 eminent figures, later became very eminent, Richard McCarthy and Ed Minsk. And they tried to get funding from the Ford Foundation. So they wrote this proposal for a summer school, assembling some of the great specialists of the emerging computational science. So they had Norbert Wiener, Claude Shannon. I mean, every name you can think of that later became sort of a star within the field was associated with it. And they called it artificial intelligence. Now, if you read the text, you very quickly notice in the first sentence they talk about machine learning instead of intelligence. So it's very intriguing. We find a different kind of fluctuation. We go from learning, intelligence, and back and forth. And if the text is available online, you can download it. If you look at paragraph 7 of the proposal, you found something that to me was sort of an eye-opener and sort of a sight of roads not taken, if you would like, in imagining where we could be. They would say that the reason they want to devote as much effort as possible to try to produce something like a learning thinking machine, and that is to avoid unimaginative thinking. So the project in its first formulation is to stay away from unimaginative thinking. That's one reason one can perhaps call or lobby for something called imaginative computing instead of intelligent computing, because intelligence, despite all its complex history, lack and absence of consensual definition, is associated with highly questionable ideological issues going from eugenism to racism and so on and so forth. We can find there's a huge amount of reasons to try to move away from intelligence, going for imaginative, and yet we did not opt for it. And the question is why? What is it that's so significant, so powerful about this sort of appeal of intelligence? Now, there are a number of ways to try to think about it. The first one, obviously, it tries to capture, or it seems to want to propose to capture, something that is fundamentally human, that is sort of the almost privileged domain of the human, although over time we have grown accustomed to identifying certain forms of intelligence associated with the animal and other worlds that are not exclusively human. But yet we seem to still remain within this comparative model. And I would like to propose to you very quickly that that is precisely one of the difficulties someone like me, but as I said, this is a minority perspective, have with this is that precisely the comparison. I'll put it in two different ways. The first way to say it is very simple, and that is we as humans would like to set the paradigm for comparison, yet we wish to remain incomparable, which explains our malaise and difficulties with either intelligent or thinking machines. We want them to be smart, but not too smart, so they do not displace us. And this particular contradiction, this particular tension that exists between us as providing the model and the paradigm on the one hand, and at the same time refusing to be compared to this particular structure of the machine, is actually extremely powerful because it has a number of both religious as well as political issues that can emerge very, very quickly. And if you're interested in the exchanges later, we can absolutely discuss those. So the first thing is this comparative dimension is very powerful. Second, and that I think is perhaps more visible in some ways, it leads somewhat, sometimes surreptitiously, sometimes much more directly, into a creation narrative that we are all unfortunately too familiar with. The simplest version of it is that we create an entity, and this entity grows admiring us, and after a point it tries to emulate us, and then it observes us, it finds some deficiencies, tries to improve them, finds the exercise to be utterly futile, and according to this narrative, it tries to eliminate us. Now, this is obviously how Hollywood can make a lot of money, but yet, if you look historically, this is a classic creation narrative in religious terms that we find over and over again. And we have sort of embedded our relationship to a large degree within this sort of traditional reception of creation narrative with this. Why this is sort of relevant despite its sort of naivete that we can identify? First of all, because it leads us to question whether ethics can and ought to be associated with anything to deal with what we are designating today was artificial intelligence. And I propose to you that actually that is not the case and we shouldn't be doing it. It doesn't mean there are no ethical concerns. It means that ethics, the way we conceive it, no matter which tradition we come from, is not going to be able to provide any solutions or answers to address the issues and the difficulties we may be having or expecting to have with the um, technology and its deployment. I'll give you one example here that is historically very relevant, and to my knowledge, I haven't seen it anywhere being brought up. As you probably noticed, at least in the US, and to some extent in Europe and other places like China, but especially in the US, there has been this sort of obsessive concern with one more term on quotation mark existential risk that is associated with the rise in popularity and sort of the loss of control over what we sort of associate with artificial intelligence. But this existential risk tends to call immediately for another argument that is fundamentally political, and that is despite acknowledging, and I'm not sure there is such a thing as existential risk, but that's another issue. Despite sort of identifying and accepting there is such a thing, yet we have introduced another component to kind of complement and balance what we're talking about, and that is the sort of artificial intelligence arms race with China, with other players. Now, I'll give you historically, and you're welcome to go read the material, absolutely stunning. If you go back to the very early 1950s in the US, you will find a fascinating scientific that is fundamentally political and strategic debates in the US. I'm going to take the two sort of symbolic prominent figures, Teller and Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was responsible for developing, among all the group that he led, the nuclear bomb, and Teller wanted to develop the hydrogen bomb. And the debate that entered between them, Oppenheimer and his allies wanted to open the science and share it in order to avoid any potential existential risk. Whereas Teller claimed that the race with the Soviets at the time justifies both closing the science, moving away from any potential sharing, and developing a further, more powerful and more destructive bomb in order to ensure the superiority and the protection of democracy and so on and so forth. And I will, if you look at the rhetorical debate, the moves that were present in the 50s, you'll find them literally word for word reproduced today in the arguments we have by the proponents of artificial intelligence trying to justify enormous funding, closing and protecting certain kind of intellectual property associated with it in order to avoid losing this particular race with the Chinese in this particular case, very obviously. So this is, again, we see how the intersection, and especially I would say the institutional dimensions of these relatively on the surface of things, simple words that end up shaping choices, options, and determining actually absolutely very powerful and decisions making. So one aspect of this is that I would like to argue for with you is that we need to extend the word institution to go beyond the conventional institutions we're used to, the state, law, religion, but instead to include both the techniques and the discursive processes within which we can exist and be together. And it's very clear in this particular instance that in this particular sense of the institution, we have had very serious mutations and transformations. I'll take two quick examples. The first one, I will take borders. We can tell very quickly that the definition of borders, our understanding of borders, have been fundamentally, significantly transformed by digital technology. It's no longer territorial. It's no longer related to our conventional understanding of a place, of being in a place. Instead, it's associated with the circulation of particular kind of data associated with an identity, and that identity has certain links with a particular form of citizenship or belonging to a group. And we find very quickly something very different that has taken place. And obviously, we have extended territoriality to include this particular sort of representation of the digital space in particular ways. But perhaps the more sort of visible way to see it is to think about purely some of the metaphors we have used over time from the early era of the internet and then the web and then where we are today. I'll take one example I often use because it's perhaps the most successful, and that is navigation. It's very interesting that that's the word, the metaphor, the figure that was used to designate our kind of way we move around this particular space. You remember Netscape and its sort of visual representation, even the navigators, we still call them that, had names associated with those dimensions. We have Explorer, now they've changed it. We had Safari. You could sort of make out this. But why that is important? I think because obviously very quickly, if you look at navigation, you realize you're involved with something having to do with water and the sea. And it's very peculiar to think about the sea because it's very important because it has no borders. So the first thing that defines seas, they have no borders. If you are historically minded and you go back a little bit to the early period, it's associated with the space of piracy. So you end up also seeing the whole vocabulary that associated with piracy gets imported via this particular navigation in order to allow all kind of debates that are still with us today that deals with intellectual property, copyright, and now we have even more significant one because scraping is a complete inversion of everything we've done about both intellectual property and copyright with peculiar forms of both protections and calls for openness on one end, but not on the other. And you've seen the debates about why we should allow sort of this massive scraping. Also, scraping applies normally rather small scale. But just simply to point out also, and then I'll stop with this particular metaphor, is that with the navigation, we have different models associated with our presence. Either we can be in a kind of form of conquering, conquest, or discovery. And we have had both discourses go back and forth. This is obviously, you can go back to questionable texts, sometimes from about the sea, but model has existed from the ancient Greeks until today between this sort of fluctuation between the two, and our relationship has been more and more so within this. And if you would like, ultimately, is the way we inhabit those spaces have been transformed. And now we have empires, if you want to play this game. And those empires are precisely those major platforms. We used to call them closed gardens, but now they become much more significant than just simply the metaphor of the gardens, yeah, if you would like. So this is another sort of cultural dimension that I think is interesting. And if you come from where I come from, I live in the US, but I'm very interested in non-Western concerns. We find also, some people call it the global South. I'm not as much sort of devoted to that, but we find a lot of sort of forgetting of other cultural dimensions that have been totally absorbed by this particular, and that takes us back to the age of discovery or conquest or colonization, and we can sort of grow up on it as much as we do. In order to conclude for the last 10 minutes or so, two quick observations about intelligent again and intelligence. The area of my first fields of study was history of religion, the church fathers, as well as other things. And if I read today what we tend to have under the name intelligent design, which is obviously tries to argue against the scientific um, theories, that basically show that there is something like evolution with all the complexity we can have with it. I remind you that intelligent design emerged in the late 16th, early 17th century in debate about the treatises demonstrating the existence of God. And the initial argument we'll find in treatises against either Spinoza or other philosophers. And the argument is very simple early on, and we still find it today among some of the scientists. And that is, if we look around the structure of the world, we find that there is a particular aesthetic quality. And this aesthetic quality cannot exist arbitrarily. It cannot be the product of chance. It has to be the product of some entity that has designed it. And that's the argument that tended to be used to induce then and conclude of the existence of a particular sort of godlike figure. We have obviously that association with intelligence, I think, needs to be brought back because that is extremely problematic and sort of infuses to some extent and propagates itself within uh, this particular thing. Second comment on intelligence, there is a beautiful is probably not the correct word, text written by the first medical Nobel Prize in France called The Stupid Man, L'Homme Stupide. It's from the early 20th century, and it is one of the most racist, explicitly racist books you read. And it tries to define and measure the degree of stupidity of human groups by race, by skin color, and so on and so forth. So simply to point out that we anthropologists have studied a lot of those works. What I find interesting is that the opposition there is intelligent, stupid, and yet today we do not have that opposition anymore between artificial intelligence. I don't hear anything about artificial stupidity or anything of the sort. Now, obviously, there is a form of idiocy that can be much more interesting if you take it in the etymological sense. I remind you that in the old days, someone like Giambattista Vico used to refer himself as an idiot, not to be pejorative, but that in order to distinguish himself from the classical philosopher like Descartes or others that he was criticizing, just simply to point out that this divide that intelligence brings in obviously is quite significant. Now, obviously, this is not my concern, but as you probably know, there are a lot of studies about digital labor and artificial intelligence, the ecological and energy water issue involved with it. So one can go on those concerns. Obviously, that is not the topic here. Instead, I would like just to go back to where I started with the comments about science fiction and why that perhaps is very important, a particular kind of science fiction that seems to shape and predefine what we end up addressing and dealing with. In that sense, that's why someone like Zelazny or Stevenson are extremely powerful figures that merit to be studied precisely within this perspective. But to try to end with one book that has been sort of existed from the 60s, obviously, but it always comes back recently because of the new film adaptation, that is Dune. For those of you who have read the book, and certainly for some of you who have seen either the older version with Lynch or the new one with Villeneuve, you notice there's something called the Butlerian Jihad. That is very important. Butlerian Jihad is the war against the machines that is led by the Fremen that will go out after the triumph of the battle that takes place on Arrakis. Why I evoke that? Because it takes us back to one particular figure that I think has shaped in more powerful ways than we're willing to almost acknowledge our relationship with digital technology, especially since the emergence of things like avatars, the metaverse, and so on and so forth. And that is Samuel Butler. Samuel Butler, 19th century English author from Cambridge. His father did not like him very much, so he sent him into exile. in New Zealand for the poor man at the time, who spent a few years there. So he wrote a number of essays, a number of books, and later he will come back and become very famous. He will write a book about the Victorians, but he wrote two important things that are relevant to us. One, which is probably one of the first early great science fiction novels, Erewhon, which is nowhere inverted, that tells us the role of memory and the transmission of the living principle within communities. But especially, he wrote one particular text that I think has been extremely, absolutely powerful, called Darwin Among the Machines. And Darwin Among the Machines is about 4 pages long. You can download it for free from the New Zealand Public Library. It basically has two elements to it. The first one is trying to figure out how the size of technology modifies the inhabited social space. Give you an example. Ancient populations had good ways to measure the passing of time, but they were very complex and very difficult to construct. We look at the Sumerian, Babylonian, and so on and so forth. And over time, we developed more technology. And let's start right where we created these sort of clocks that can exist in the center of a village or a town or a city. And one observation he will put up, he said, the moment that visible measure of time as a technique is introduced into the social space, the structure of daily life and its temporality are radically transformed. Suddenly, the moment of prayer, the private moment, the moment to eat, so on and so forth, become visible, comparable, and you can no longer extend them at your wish because it's visible to everyone and everyone has to obey, so to speak, the same rule. And then he goes further. He says, initially they were in the public space, then they entered into the household. So you have these grandfather's clocks. And suddenly we interiorize even within the private space itself, the modifications brought in by the measurement of time in this particular case. And then he goes on to say, when they become miniaturized and we wear them on ourselves, we become enslaved by them. So you check your time all the time, you're constrained by it. So the conclusion of it is it's more powerful and it is more determining by its miniaturization. And I propose to you what we are slowly starting to see with generative AI is that we started with these large scale, you have to go out, look for it, and it's slowly moving toward this miniaturization moment. It's coming to your iPhone, it's coming to all kind of smaller things that you carry on yourself, and your body becomes part and parcel of it, and its implications remain to be seen. And I think something we need to question in very remarkable ways. So it's sort of one thing we get out. And the second thing we get out, which is more interesting because it has sort of nourished imagination over time. He said we constructed these beautiful machines. He's talking about steam at the time, trains, and so on and so forth. But we need to keep feeding them. We need to keep giving them resources in order for them to continue to function and work. And at the end, he notices, and this is where we're living in the Butlerian moment right now, I would say, with the sort of exaggerated existential risk. He said, either at some point we have to decide whether we want to continue to feed them and become their slaves, or whether we want to go to war with them and try to destroy them. And the divide will enter between us and the machine world. And he obviously opts for the destruction of the machines in order to return to some semblance, what would call, so to speak, of authenticity, if you would like. Now, this is obviously an exaggerated scenario, but I think what's intriguing about it, and that's why I find, is that it's absolutely extremely effective in shaping our imagination about the technologies and that we are dealing with. We still perceive this sort of divide between us and the machine. To conclude, I think it's an old problem that has taken on new dimensions that are more interesting, and that is perhaps our difficulty is with adapting or developing different ways of dealing with delegation. We used to be able to delegate in more significant and controlled ways, whether at the state collective level or whether at the individual level. And now I would say within the sort of new machine, quotation mark, universe we're inhabiting, delegation becomes extremely more difficult because it's not clear how much we're delegating. It's not clear we can revoke forms of delegations we used to be able to do. And those are both political as well as epistemological concern. Second aspect associated with it, it relates to our own conceptions of autonomy itself. In other words, in the old days, we used to conceive of autonomy in a relatively complex, evolving way over time, but still within the kind of etymological sense, autonomos. We can give ourselves our own rules, if you would like. But obviously, autonomy and delegation are almost inseparable. Remind you, if you read the old dictionaries from the old encyclopedias from the 18th and some of the 17th centuries, they always gave one example of autonomy. That is the Roman Empire, in order to show that it was absolutely powerful, it allowed former Greek states to live according to their old constitutions. In other words, you delegate to the local certain power, and that is a proof of obviously your autonomy. I think we're facing peculiar moments at both the individual and the collective levels, and we don't yet have the vocabulary nor I think the tool for to deal with it. One illustration of it, the Europeans, and you guys represent that, opted for trustworthiness and human values in addressing artificial intelligence. The US here, we opted for democracy. We're not talking about the same thing. The orientation from the DoD text that basically sets the rules that then later the executive order from the White House chooses democracy as the main value to be associated with what we wish to accomplish and how we used to regulate or not. Chinese, obviously, you would not be surprised, opted for harmony, going back for a Confucian model in order to try to play a much more complex, perhaps, game between the two. But to conclude completely with a historical reference, there is a very beautiful text by Leibniz from 1690 that circulated, it's like 4 pages long, and circulated in Latin with a tiny French translation entitled La doctrine de la raison humaine, the doctrine of human reason. It's an absolutely remarkable text. It also explains why Norbert Wiener, as well all the other computational original figures opted for Leibniz instead of Newton and other scientists. And what does Leibniz do? He says, well, listen, I have this very odd idea since I've been working on probabilities. And I think I can figure out in German, in French, and in English, and so on and so forth, taking into account the number of letters in each language and the number of consonants and vowels, at what moment in each of those languages every possible word would have been uttered in that language. And he develops an algorithm that gives you a number that in French, after a certain particular time, taking into account potential growth of population and speakers, when every single possible word combinations could have occurred. What we have a remarkable generative algorithm from 1690 that basically trying to identify in each particular language at what moment everything would have been said, and Leibniz said 2 important things. Then he says, and then after that, all we do is repeat each other, repeat ourselves, perhaps in different orders, but nevertheless, we cannot say something that has not been said before. But that's sort of not as interesting as a classic commonplace within that word. And this is what I would like to conclude with. He says, par contre, what's very interesting is that I can calculate all these kind of moments at which something would have been uttered, but I cannot tell you at what moment any of these would have been thought. He wants to distinguish between utterance and thinking. And to some extent, our question today is going back to this peculiar issue. this chat GPT, its hallucinations, all these kind of issues we keep talking about to some extent that is sort of the ultimate, for the time being anyway, incarnation of artificial intelligence. Are they simply utterances that need to be taken for what they are? Emily Benders called them stochastic parrots. Other people disagree. Or are they some form of thinking and reasoning? So far as I can tell, the scientific uh, um, literature says that there is no reasoning. So therefore, we're into the realm of utterance, but that realm of utterance has political ramifications, and to some extent, social ramifications are very, very important. And I think the questions remain to be open, and perhaps one more reason to try to resist this sort of drive toward intelligence and to think perhaps otherwise. And I thank you very much. I think it's about time for me to stop.